Resume. Okay. Hello, everybody. My name is Paige Shanno. I'm an occupational therapist here at Kinetic Edge. Today's webinar is obviously about sleeping and getting to sleep, but also staying asleep. Maybe. There we go. Okay, so the objectives, what we're going to cover today is the importance of sleep, which I'm sure we all know, but we're just going to review anyway. Some signs of sleep deprivation, keys to staying or falling and staying asleep, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. So you can jot them down in the question and answer, or you can hold them until the end, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. So why is sleep important? Sleep is food for the brain. The way that our brain processes memory throughout the day is very superficial until you fall asleep at night. And then during sleep, our memory goes from short-term to long-term. So everything that we're learning throughout the day, all those skills that we're acquiring, we need sleep in order to store it into long-term memory in order to access again in the future. We have a lot of important body functions like rest and digest that need to occur when we're sleeping, and brain activity that occurs subconsciously while we're sleeping that we don't get when we're awake. Sleep and arousal are on opposite sides of the continuum of alertness. And if we are not getting enough sleep, then our arousal system is also affected. So with one comes the other, and with lack of one comes lack of the other, or an excess of the other. And honestly, that's probably the part that you guys are seeing the most in terms to your kiddos' behavior, just because it can be overactivated. Our arousal system can be too high, and then that limits the sleep that we're able to get. 70%, almost 70% of American infants, children, and teens are sleep deprived. We just live in a really fast-paced world, and sleep's probably the most affected of our occupations because of that. So what does sleep deprivation look like for emotion? So sometimes parents are like, I don't know if the sleep's not good or what's happening. Do you think this is because lack of sleep? The next couple of slides are going to go over some of the symptoms of sleep deprivation and what it can look like. So this would be easily getting frustrated, losing it over little things like if their sibling takes a toy, or if they spill something, if they can't get the scissors to work on the first try, if their routine changes frequently, or not, sorry, if their routine changes out of the blue, like things that we're expecting to go to Walmart maybe, and now you can't go to Walmart, then they have a meltdown, and it just takes a longer time to calm them down. Physically, this is interesting. You're 86% more likely to end up in the ER if you're sleep deprived, just because our body's not operating on, 100% battery. And this could also be seen as hyperactivity. They have the second wind at bedtime, which we'll talk about later. If they have a hard time waking up in the morning, excessive craving of carbohydrates, stomach headaches, and anxiety. Other things that could be physically altered, or if they snore, if they have restless legs, our body has to constantly monitor our arousal level, right? So if we are not getting enough sleep, then it has to maintain enough arousal to keep us awake. And that depletes our energy storage, because we have to dig deeper to get to the same level of arousal as if we were operating on full sleep. Attention and focus. I don't know about you guys, but if I am sleep deprived, I have a really hard time staying on task or focusing. Might take a couple of repeats to understand what someone's trying to say to me. So kids might seek stimulation to keep them awake. They might need more attention or help to stay on task. They have difficulty making decisions, don't listen, talk excessively. Stress hormones are released when we're overtired, which increases our alertness, right? Because it's using that fight or flight system. So now the brain is automatically hyper aware of what's happening in the surroundings and not necessarily paying attention to what's on task. So our brain is in survival mode because we don't have enough of the calming hormones in our system. And then we miss out on all these external things that pertain to higher level learning versus just like maintaining alertness to our environment and staying alive. This also is really easily affected because only 41 minutes of sleep deprivation decreases your ability to pay attention and be alert. Something that we like to talk about here is that it's not because they won't sleep, it's because they can't sleep. So keep that in mind when you're like, they just won't sleep. Yes, you are correct. But they also are not able to, and we need to help their body get to that point. Socially, they can be bossy or demanding. Their feelings are easily hurt, difficult being patient. Being told no, this is a huge trigger we see a lot in clinic. Late afternoon difficulties, after lunch difficulties, or just not wanting to follow the rules. So on the opposite side of the spectrum, this is what good sleep leads to. It's all the opposites of what we just talked about. So we have higher grade point averages, better math skills, higher reading scores, improved focus and attention, less conflict between family members and peers, fewer accidents, strong immune systems, so less illness, fewer cavities and gum disease, and lower susceptibility of obesity. So obviously, we all want good sleep, and we all want our kids to have good sleep because that's why you guys are here. Let's talk about sleep needs and what typical age ranges need. Now, these are just recommended hours. These are not cut and dry, so please don't fret if they don't match entirely. These are just general guidelines. Some kids need more sleep than it's recommended, and some kids need less. But this is more for kids that if we are not getting enough sleep at all, like less than 6 hours total, you're thinking, then this is a good place to start, a good goal for us to measure sleep against so that we can set realistic expectations for ourselves. On average, only teens and adults only average 6 to 7 hours a night. And as you can see, adolescents and adults need at least 8 hours. So as a society as a whole, we are not doing well with getting enough sleep. So how did we get here? We could probably talk about this in and of itself in its own presentation. There's a lot going on in today's world. The technology stimulation for our brains is just astronomical in terms of how it affects our attention, our sleep, our focus. If I could recommend one thing right now without hearing any of your stories, it'd be to cut technology time and limit it like 120 minutes before bed. This is shown to be a huge game changer in terms of falling and staying asleep because the blue light just stimulates our brain. I'll talk about that more later. This is interesting too. The schedules now are around adult availability. So for example, if your kid has a t-ball game, instead of being at 4 p.m., now it might be at 8 p.m. to accommodate adult schedules. So we're just getting later and later into the evening and pushing into that bedtime. If we have any separate family households, or if someone's away for work or something like that, that can affect our sleep. Environmental noise, any sort of stimulation that comes from the external world can be considered environmental noise. Exposure to violence. This one has some really interesting research that kids just have a harder time falling and staying asleep when they're exposed to violence. And then the achievement needs and competition. This is because kids are just more driven. They have a lot more competition and not necessarily pressure, but they feel the pressure internally to perform and do the best that they can. Hang on, let me just make sure that sound machines can be an environmental noise. However, sometimes they are necessary to help kids. It depends on what type of sensory preference they have. So Chelsea, remind me a little bit, we're going to talk about that. I'm talking more like if you live on a busier street, or if there's like a TV on in the background or something like that. So the main culprits are tension, time, and temperament or sensory preferences. So the tension, oftentimes this is if we're not feeling calm enough to fall asleep, the brain has to feel safe. It's the same part of the brain, the same aspect as the alertness with the survival instinct. So if we're activating the fight or flight response, then we're not going to feel safe enough to sleep because the brain feels like it needs to be awake to protect us. Time, our body needs to have a set clock, that circadian rhythm that tells us when to go to bed, and we need a regular schedule in order to set that brain clock. And then temperament, sometimes we need assistance to calm down, and then we all have sensory preferences. So those are something that need to be taken into consideration with the sleep. So some tension. Now, tension doesn't necessarily have to be good or bad. It could be both. It could be one. It could be either of them. So some common triggers for distress are parental stress. If there is a separation or like something upsetting, like maybe we're moving, our friends are moving. And then unfortunately, a lack of sleep can lead to more lack of sleep. It just continues that cycle of sleep deprivation that is really tricky to get out of. Studies show, they took a saliva sample test in one research study I was reading, that parents who have high stress levels those stress levels tend to be higher in their kids as young as 4 years old. So kids pick up on their parents' stress. And so that's why it's really important for us as adults to monitor our own mental health and stress levels so that we can put the best foot forward and show kids how to better handle their emotions and their stress. And then some common triggers for excitement can be overstimulation, overscheduling, anticipation, growth spurts. Research shows that the 3 weeks before and after your common milestones, kids have honestly, their body's just processing a lot because they're going through a growth spurt. So this needs more energy to have to literally grow and develop. And so the body's not going to sleep as well. So that's something that we can plan for and have a set idea of how to handle it in the future versus it coming up on us and we are freaking out because now our kid's not getting enough sleep. And then that peer pressure or competition to perform. Something that I think is another one of the things besides technology that I would right away suggest is looking at your schedule. If you're feeling overwhelmed and stressed out by all the things that you need to get done with like going from place to place, then likely your kid is too. If it's too much for you to handle, then your kid's not going to be doing very well with it. So maybe look and sitting down and really prioritizing what you think is the most important. Maybe instead of playing soccer in both the spring and the fall, they just play it during one season, and give yourself time to kind of rest in between these days so that you're not constantly going, and your system has to just maintain that level of awareness. Something that's really important to easing tension is having a nest. So we need this nest or a haven to feel safe and secure. So one thing that I suggest frequently to parents is get in your kiddo's bed. See what it feels like. Are the sheets comfortable? Do you like the cushion of the mattress? And ask your kids, like, is there something that we can change about your bed to make it more comfortable? As you can see in this first picture, that was back in college, I found out that I really need a blanket underneath my arms to feel safe. I don't know where it came from, but I found it out in college and I have done it ever since. Sometimes kids need stuffed animals or like really fuzzy blankets or a weighted blanket or body pillow, things like that. And those are things that we can talk about more in length if anyone has any questions about it. So some other ways of easing tension. I think we often underestimate just the simple act of naming the tension itself and how helpful that can be, because kids may not understand what they're feeling on the inside. If they feel that like bubbly wiredness, they're like, I don't know, it's just how my body feels. But if we give them words to describe that sensation, then they're able to communicate with us and we can help them work through that versus we're just guessing based on their actions. So if we can give them the tools to communicate, then we can help them regulate. So sometimes we use words like wired or energetic or bubbly, or sometimes we use this term called high engine because our brain just won't shut down. We're going super fast. Things like this. Eventually, if you're using the language, your kids will pick up on it too, and they can start to use it. So start with maybe pointing out physical traits. Like, it looks like your hands and your legs are moving really fast. What do you think that's about? Why do you think you're doing that? Or are you doing okay? It looks like you're really restless today. How are you feeling? What's your brain telling you? These questions that are kind of open-ended and give them a chance to process and think on their own can be really beneficial. And then again, the schedule, looking at that schedule and determining what your priorities are. And then calm touch. This is something that as an occupational therapist, I use all the time. I'm a tactile person anyway, so touch is always a comfort to me. And so I use it a lot with clients, as they're comfortable. But under our skin, there are tactile receptors that are craving touch most of the time, because that touch releases calming hormones to be sent to the brain. So if we can ease tension by raising calming hormones in the body, then the thought is the calming hormones will outweigh the stress hormones and allow for better sleep. If they don't like to be touched, maybe this is a sensory aversion, and that's something else we need to work on. So the second thing that can lead or be the culprit for sleep deprivation is time. This is probably the hardest one for most parents to swallow because of how fast-paced our world is, and our schedules, like staying to the same thing every day is pretty tricky. But a shift in schedule for even 1 or 2 nights is 1 or 2 nights a week is disrupting 29% of your sleep. So if you think about, even if we're going to bed late one night, that's still going to be one night, and then that sets you back the rest of the week. So if we skip a nap or we nap after 3 p.m., which we'll talk about naps later if you have specific questions with that. Adolescents who sleep longer than 45 minutes, or short naps for infants and toddlers. If there's more than 30 to 60 minutes difference in your wake times, bedtimes, or meal times. So this is the one that is really hard. So this is saying you should be getting up at between 30 to 60 minutes of that same time that you wake up every single day, going to bed between the 30 to 60 minutes of that window every single day, and eating all 3 of your meals at the same window, because your body starts to rely on this pattern and it develops a rhythm based on it. And this is what helps your body realize it's time to sleep and stay asleep. Again, we're coming back to the screen time because I cannot emphasize it enough. 60 minutes of screen time, more than that, is shown to decrease the amount of quality sleep that you get. There's special cells in the eyes that react to light. So when we see this light, it cues our brain that it's daytime. If that light is a short wavelength, then the body processes it as daytime, and it stimulates these cells to promote more awake and alert versus producing melatonin. So that's the science behind why we shouldn't have blue light late at night, because our brain is literally seeing it and thinking, oh, it's time to be awake. Versus as we start to slow down and lights turn off, our body produces melatonin naturally to help us fall and stay asleep. And then exercise in the evening. This is hard because exercise is very important, but it depends on when you exercise. And so we'll talk about that later. And then caffeine levels, which I'm naturally guilty of. But the time thing that I think I offer the most as a solution is to look at the body cues. So is your kiddo getting really sleepy, starting to rub their eyes, their eyelids are heavy, they're starting to wind down, and then 10 minutes later, they're running and sprinting and can't stop talking, and they want 8 more books and all of these things. If you can see a huge difference between one level of alertness to the other within like a 10 to 20 minute time span, you might have missed your natural sleep window. So everyone has a pretty good time, because our body runs on a clock of when they best fall asleep. So my suggestion is to move bedtime up by 15-minute intervals. So then that way you can see if that is what you need. However, I did just have a family the other day, after we talked about bedtimes and missing the sleep window, extend their bedtimes because they felt like they never reached that phase of sleepy where their eyes were getting really heavy, rubbing their eyes, sitting down more. And so they moved their bedtime back, and now they're sleeping better because they are hitting that natural window. So this is going to be more on you as parents to notice what those cues are and follow those cues. So if you notice that the cues start around 7:30, then you have a limited amount of time before their brain starts to wake them up again. Because what's happening is, if we don't fall asleep within that sleep window, our brain thinks, oh no, I need to stay up and survive a little bit longer. So that it ramps up all of your alerting hormones and chemical processes that are happening in your brain, so that your brain can stay awake and you can survive, and you don't hurt yourself on accident. So instead of falling asleep, you're actually super wired. It's the second wind of the evening. This happens a lot, like at sleepovers when you're I remember when I was younger, I was like, oh, why am I so hyper? It's like 1 a.m. It was because I had missed my sleep window and my body was pushing me to stay up. And then if you're trying to fall asleep during that, your brain's going way too fast and it's hard to settle back down. A good night's sleep starts in the morning. So something that happens when I have families come in that are specifically concerned with sleep is we look at their morning routine too. Are we starting the day with a good setup? Are we starting with a running behind? Is it hard to wake up in the morning? Are we getting a look at sunlight? If we can. I mean, it depends on what time of year it is. If the sun's up when we get up. Are we moving slowly or quickly? Are we tense? Are we anxious about the day? All these things can affect us throughout the day, which then leads us to affecting the sleep. It's okay to wake up kids if it keeps you on your schedule. I think that sometimes the parents are a little nervous because they're like, well, he's not sleeping, so I'm going to let him sleep as long as possible. But if we're trying to set like a really strict schedule so that our body can start to realize what that rhythm is, it's okay to wake them up. And eventually the body will start to process that routine and they won't need to be woken up, or they're less likely to need woken up. So how do we set the body clock? Establishing those regular, consistent wake times. The key phrase of this would be consistency. Are we napping at regular times? Are we establishing regular meal times? Are they getting exposure to morning light? Limiting screen time. Exercise can be done before or in the evening. Just try not to do it right before bed because it raises your body temperature, and our body temperature needs to lower as it sleeps. So that's something to keep in mind, like especially for those parents that are like, well, he needs to burn off energy. That's great. Maybe they do need to burn off energy. Just do it an hour before, so that they are able to calm their mind and their body down in order to fall asleep. And then avoiding caffeine. Nutrition and sleep. I think this is often overlooked as a solution to helping with sleep, but sleep can happen, or poor sleep can happen based on what we eat as well. There's an association between refined sugars and lower fruits and veggies and poor sleep. There's a link between carbohydrates, so sugars, affecting our REM sleep, which is our deep sleep and helps us feel the most rested. So the more refined carbohydrates we have, the less REM sleep that we get. And then simple carbohydrates, which are those refined carbohydrates, and saturated fats can also be dangerous. Limit our ability to fall asleep well and stay asleep because it can cause a spike in blood sugar that later crashes and may wake the kid up. So something that I often recommend is if we need a snack before bed, and maybe kids do need a snack before bed, is that it's protein or a healthier fat. And then that will help them stay fuller longer, so they will stay asleep longer. Something else I often recommend is using like a straw. So maybe you make a strawed protein smoothie or shake that they can drink from, because that's how we first learn how to soothe ourselves as infants, is sucking through things or sucking things. So we try to mimic that as much as possible as a sensory strategy to help kids fall asleep. And then that third culprit of poor sleep is the temperament or sensory preferences. Now, every single person in the world has their own sensory preferences, and some are more alike than others, but some kids may have like a higher need of sensory input than what we would call neurotypical kids. And that's okay, because I'm what I would consider a sensory seeker, and I'm functioning and doing what I need to do. I just realize when I need to have sensory input. So we have to help kids figure this out when they're young so that they're able to make these good decisions and regulate themselves, which helps them fall asleep. So my mission would be, my very first mission for you as parents is to lay down, if you can, in a kiddo's bed and to do what we talked about earlier with the nest and just go through all 5 of your senses. Is there something like a shadow that's poking out and because of, wall hangings or murals, or maybe the window shades flutter and the tree shadow comes through? Is there a really annoying background noise like the heater that goes on and off? Or are the sheets really scratchy, or maybe they're too thick and you get really hot, or the kiddo gets really hot? So go through all of your senses and just see if there's anything that stands out. is something that might need to be changed. And feel free to ask your kiddo too if they're able to tell you these things. They'll have really good input. Sometimes it's hard as parents to believe when our kids are telling us these things, because we're like, we just go to bed, like you're just making excuses. But if they say something doesn't smell or like feel right, then it might be because their sensory awareness is just telling them that they're not comfortable. So like I said earlier, it's really hard for me to fall asleep if I don't have that blanket tucked under my arms, but it's also really hard for me to fall asleep if I don't have background noise on. So if I don't have a fan on, then it's too quiet and my brain goes too fast. So it's things like that where we just have to be aware of our personal preferences and preferences of our kiddos too. Helping them identify these things while they're awake can help you when they're trying to sleep too. Establishing routines. So this is something that if we've gone through all the prep work, we've done all of our, let's try this, then we really break down this routine as like our next step. So try to find something. This is like in the evening when you start to notice their cues, or before you even notice their cues of being tired, find a transition activity. So this could be, maybe we're cleaning up all of the toys for the day, we're getting our pajamas on, we're brushing our teeth, maybe we're following a visual schedule of these things. Then we move on to calming and connecting. So this is like the touch factor. So maybe we're providing a massage, or we're just scratching their head or playing with their hair. If they're a worrier, maybe they need a journal to jot things down to get out of their brain. Reading books, talking about the day, some sort of thing between you and your kid that helps them calm down, but allows them to get anything off their mind that they need to. And then a cue for sleep. So this is the moving from you're actively talking and engaging with your child to, okay, we're going to try and shut off voices, and maybe I'll literally turn off the light, I'll turn on a sound machine, maybe we need to say a prayer, and then this is the body's cue that sleep is the next step. So trying to let the kiddos fall asleep independently so that they are able to stay asleep throughout the night is the ultimate goal, right? So maybe start with just sitting on your child's bed and giving them a massage while they're falling asleep. And then maybe we can move to the door. And then we can come back in 5 minutes and check on them. The other thing to keep in mind is how our brain processes sensory information. So this is a sensory motor planning worksheet that I use a lot with parents. As you can see, the arrows pointing to the right of the screen and down is how our brain, it's increased arousal levels. So that little turned box on the bottom corner that says language, this is the hardest sensory input for our brain to process. So this is probably the least important thing for you to do before bed when you switch to that, the cueing and the bedtime. During the first two portions of your routine, do what you need to do. But then the last two of them, trying to limit language as much as possible, because the brain needs more power to process this. Conversely, on the other side of the chart, on the left-hand side, these are really easy sensations for the brain to process, which is why I suggest using a straw for a protein smoothie before bed, or maybe even having candle or a Scentsy or something like that that's on a timer. With something sweet and vanilla scented, like cupcake scented. This could be really calming for kiddos. Things like that move towards the left side of the chart. And then in the middle, the tactile vestibular and the two vestibular columns, because they're not too far on one side or the other, these are going to be your most organizing columns. They're the best for keeping our brain balanced. So if you feel like we're still really struggling and you don't want to use language, but we're not quite asleep yet, you can use that. I would specifically recommend the tactile column. So maybe if they can't tolerate your touch, they need a weighted blanket or a stuffed animal that's big that they can cuddle with. Especially if you're trying to get them to sleep independently, having a body pillow or a big stuffed animal is really helpful, because then they don't feel that lack of space or the lack of your presence basically when they wake up in the middle of the night, because we want to keep the sleeping environment the same when we fall asleep as when we wake up, because then that way when kids wake up, they're not like, oh my gosh, where's mom? she's gone, I can't find her anymore, it's probably danger and I need to get up and go find her, they realize, oh, this is the exact same way I fell asleep. I have my blanket, I have my teddy bear, my body knows this is the cue for sleep, and so they can fall back asleep without needing you. Some other research-based tips: monitoring the screen day, not just before, or screen time, not just before bed, but throughout the day, but especially 2 hours before bed. This one's kind of or not controversial, but it's an interesting fact. Like, a lot of times baths can increase our arousal levels, especially if kids love baths and they love bath time. It can also increase our body temperature, which, just like exercise, we want to keep our body temperature lower as we're going to bed. So this is something you'll have to know your kid's personal arousal level when it comes to bath time. If it's something that they can handle, then great. Yeah, it could be a really calming part of your transition activity. But if you know that they just absolutely love bath time, maybe you need to move it up in the evening. And we suggest about 60 to 90 minutes before bed. Setting concrete boundaries. This one is also very important. This is saying something like, we're only reading 2 books. I'm only going to come back 3 times and I'll come back every 5 minutes. Something that they know that they can plan ahead in their mind, so they're not just questioning like, oh, maybe they won't come back. And then this is equally as important: if you're setting these boundaries, follow through on them. So if you're saying, I'm going to come back in 5 minutes, and you don't show up, your kiddo's not going to feel safe, because they're like, oh no, they said they were going to come back. So come back when you say you're going to come back. Eventually, over time, kids learn, okay, I can trust her or him when they say that they'll be back, and they don't have to keep up. This works. This is a really good hack, per se, for kiddos who absolutely need a parent to stay with them and wake up as soon as the parent leaves the room. I will suggest sitting on the edge of the bed first, moving to the door, and then going out the door and say, I'll check back in 5 minutes, and doing that until they fall asleep. Over time, they start to rely less and less on your presence, because they know that you will come when they need you. And then planning ahead for these big changes. So like, if we're going to have a growth spurt, maybe we need to have a protein snack or some other healthy form of a snack on the bedside next to us, so that if we do wake up in the middle of the night, we can get those extra calories and that energy into our system and help us fall back asleep. Holidays are super exciting. I never stayed asleep on Christmas Eve because I was so excited for Santa to come. So preparing for less sleep on those days, really making sure you're following through with your routine, even if you're somewhere else, trying to keep it the same as possible. Same with vacations and stuff like that. Something else to keep in mind: when you're following these routines and you come home late, try to stick to the same amount of time that it takes you on a normal evening. Even though it's going to put you to sleep later, it'd be better for you to follow that routine and for the body to pick up those cues naturally. And then you just have to try your best to maintain that schedule the rest of the week at your normal sleep time. But don't ever rush through the bedtime routine, because this might trigger some of the arousal systems in the body and just keep the kiddo up. To nap or not to nap? This is a $1 million question right here. The short answer is it depends. If they're already napping, go ahead and stick to the routine. If they aren't napping, then you can try setting a wake time and adjust the naps on their behavior. So a lot of this, and this would be something that I might ask someone else on, like ask myself for, help with determining whether or not they need a nap and the cues that you could look for. But nap should be less than 2 hours and before 3 p.m. for kiddos who are a little bit older. The sleep cycle is 60 minutes for kiddos, and this is important that they reach the sleep cycle, but we don't want to do too much, because otherwise they won't fall asleep at night. But the importance of napping is dependent on the kid themselves. Okay, now that we talked about falling asleep, let's talk about staying asleep. So it's the same premise. We want to follow the routine as best as possible, so that the kids can learn what to expect. When we set the rhythm, the circadian rhythm, with our falling asleep, it's going to affect how we stay asleep as well. Making sure we're going to sleep with just the right level of arousal. So this is saying we do need to exercise. Exercise is an important part of a kid's life and their ability to grow and develop, but we just need to make sure we're doing it at a time when their body can process it. So if we didn't get any exercise in that day, your kid might be more wired. And so you might have to do more during the calm down phase of your routine to help them kind of come down from that energy level. But you don't want to push it back too late because of, staying on routine. Then this is the same point I was making earlier. Environment should be the same as when they fall asleep. Something that I had a parent suggest to me that works really well for them, and I think is absolutely genius, is a self turn off or self shut down. Maybe that's the right word for it. Heating pad, because that mimics like the warmth of a parent being there. So if you feel like that's what's keeping your kid up or coming to get you because they just really like the feeling and the comfort of having you near, try having a heating pad next to the kiddo that shuts off after an hour or so. And then they can teach them how to turn it on so that they can feel safe and comfortable and warm in their bed. Then you might have to adjust like levels of blankets and stuff too, depending on how hot that heating pad can get. Respecting the child's clock and making sure that you are watching for those cues and making the child feel safe. This is especially important for any trauma cases. Sleep is a really vulnerable time for everyone, and especially if you've gone through trauma in your early childhood life, then feeling safe is really difficult. So doing all we can to make kiddos feel safe and secure. The safeness can come into play with trying to determine whether or not you should go to them when they're upset. Something that I like to suggest or get parents to think about is, if they were crying that way during the day, would you go to them or would you ignore them? Most of the time, we're probably not going to ignore a kid if they're hysterically crying during the day. We would go and comfort them, even if the problem is seemingly small. We want our kids to feel safe and heard when they're sleeping too. And we can just learn how to best make them feel safe and heard. Unless you feel like the crying is kind of like a made up excuse and they're doing it as a way to just get out of bed. So that kind of depends on the kiddo's temperament too. But if they're genuinely scared and crying for you, it's okay to go to them because they just need comfort and touch. This is something that we do here in the research, the clinic. It's called the abdominal sleep reflex. I cannot tell details on it just for legal purposes, but it uses this program that we do here a lot at Kinetic Edge called MNRI, which is Moscotova neuromotor reflex integration. This reflex targets the natural stores of melatonin in our body. Sometimes this reflex is super present for kids who aren't sleeping, and we need to get the reflex to kind of settle down and the body to start releasing melatonin on a more natural basis. So this is something that I can only teach if you guys are coming to see me, just because of the legal purposes, but it is an option. And then other resources may be necessary to solve the sleep problem. This, like OT, is definitely a solution, but it may not be the only solution. I recently heard some evidence about medication affecting sleep levels. So if your kid's taking any medication for, maybe ADHD or anxiety or something like that, that can sometimes affect your REM sleep. Maybe your kid has an actual sleep disorder, and that's something that we need to look into medically. Maybe they are having medical issues that are affecting how they sleep because their energy levels are just being depleted, taking with their body, trying to fight these other things. And this is something that would probably be best through a one-on-one conversation, just trying to determine whether or not the need is there to go seek a doctor or sleep specialist versus maybe treating it with a more conservative approach with OT. We do free screens here at Kinetic Edge. They're 20 minutes long. It's basically to determine whether or not I think you might need OT, if it could be beneficial for you. Myself and my supervisor, Elise Sprunk, are the two occupational therapists here at Pella, but we have Kinetic Edges in the central Iowa region. So you can always look and see on our website what is closest to you. And we'd be happy to help you find one as well if you give us a call. Here is my information. If anyone has any questions that they think of later, or for those who are getting the link to this PowerPoint presentation or this webinar, they can email me later. Or if you want to speak to me directly, you can call this number. No guarantees I'll be able to answer, but you can leave a message and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. I'll leave it here for another 10 seconds. So if someone needs to write it down, they can. These are some of the resources I used. The book Sleepless in America by Mary was phenomenal, but I read it so that you don't have to. If you want to get it and read it yourself, awesome. But I tried to condense and summarize it as much as possible into this PowerPoint. A lot of the ideas that I use on a regular basis with sleep patients comes from her book. Does anyone have any questions? This is also, I just put the free screen QR code back up, but if you have any questions, you can type it in the question and answer. Chelsea, do you feel like I answered your question about the sound machine, or would you like me to, or do you have any other questions about that? This will also be, obviously it's being recorded right now and will be sent to you probably by Tassie later so that you can review it, because I talk fast. So if you ever have to review or, look at the screen for more than the 2 seconds I took to go over it, you are more than welcome to. Some other protein sources, because I get this question a lot, are Orgain Kids protein smoothies. Tastes a lot like chocolate milk, and kids seem to really love it. I think I've had one parent who said whose kids don't love it, and then their siblings liked it, so it wasn't a waste of money because the other kids liked it. I've had good success with like those fiber filled, they're called energy bites, which seems counterproductive because we're trying to like not give kids energy, but it's because they're filled with fiber and protein, which helps kids stay full longer and would help them sleep. And then Pediasure also has a protein based shake, I believe. That's based for kids versus your typical adult protein shakes, which might have a little bit more chemical chemicals added into, which might affect it a little bit more. So those are the typical ones I usually recommend. I'm going to give it a couple more minutes for anyone to ask questions. Feel free to leave the presentation if you don't have anything else to ask. Thank you all for attending, and hopefully you learned something today.